Mindfulness Association has a very particular approach to mindfulness training, and as far as I know, it seems to go deeper or wider or further, or whatever the right word might be, than most other trainings, which it's much more than just doing an 8-week course and repeating it. We have these 3 modules of mindfulness, compassion and insight, levels 1, 2 and 3. And this comes from Rob Nairn's original vision of how mindfulness could be presented. And these 3 modules of mindfulness, compassion and insight are very much connected, and they overlap. So it doesn't mean that we just do mindfulness with no compassion, it doesn't mean we just do insight with no mindfulness, and so on. And compassion is there throughout the whole training. But the emphasis in each module is for mindfulness, compassion and insight. And Rob described it as being that mindfulness is knowing what's happening when it's happening, compassion is accepting what's happening when it's happening, and insight is recognizing what's happening when it's happening. So, the first step of mindfulness is recognizing the unsettled mind and realizing that thoughts arise autonomously. We can't stop thinking. That's the first mistake that needs to be addressed, really. And we use fairly simple but quite subtle techniques of staying present so that we can actually acknowledge what's happening and turn inwards. Now, of course, when people turn inwards and move away a little bit from the habitual distraction, what they see might not be what they want to see. And, some of my habits may be not what I would want them to be. And so that really requires quite a bit of self-compassion that, this human situation, part of the human condition, just like everyone else, because if I would see this and not have that compassion, then I can't leave my experience alone. I feel that I have to fix it. I have to either attack it or improve it. And through the compassion training, we learn not to do that. We learn to be with it, let it be there. And this really then sets up the possibility of the insight training. The essence of the insight training is that thoughts arise, they appear, and if we leave them alone, they will disappear. And that enables us to find our own home of resting, a place we can always go to. But what happens is, when an uncomfortable thought arises, and here we're looking at the real building blocks, desire and aversion and jealousy and pride, these things that really make us jump into the river in the metaphor of the undercurrent observer, the really things that I've got to do something about that. And we tell ourselves stories. So in the insight module in particular, again, rather than demonizing these stories and saying I shouldn't have them and try to suppress them, we explore them. Not as a therapy, but in terms of actually experiencing that energy and letting it be there and becoming familiar with it and seeing that if left alone, it will settle. So, this is massive. And I really don't think any other trainings address the mind to this level. I think generally people learn mindfulness, and simply by recognizing that they're not their thoughts, that's a huge relief. Learning to not make things worse, the healing power of mind does take over and things do get a bit better. But this is a way of dealing with the much deeper, more ingrained habits. And of course, at the centre of all of these habits is what in Buddhist terminology is called fundamental ignorance. This feeling of a separate self. And the irony of this process is that in grasping and desiring, that strengthens the feeling of self. the stronger feeling of self strengthens the grasping. In trying to push something away, that again increases that feeling of separation, self and other, self and world. And same with pride and jealousy. The common denominator of all these is that they strengthen the feeling of separation, loneliness, and a solid self that can never actually be satisfied. So, in the insight module, we do to some extent identify that, and there's no point in attacking it. How can you fight with yourself? But we do use the four immeasurables, kindness and compassion and sympathetic joy and equanimity, as not a remedy, because this isn't a remedial path. It's more of looking directly. And we can see that there is an alternative, because the space is there, but we fill it with our stories. And the stories are always much worse than the reality. So having finished that training, which is never really finished, we're then, in my view, we're then ready to start the path. This is when we can really start to practice. And so this is why we devised the program Mindfulness for Life, this level 4 training. For people who've got some sense of mindfulness, compassion and insight, so that then within the level 4 trainings we've got a group of really experienced and committed practitioners who can come together. We use a lot of insight dialogue, inquiry, reflection and resting at a much deeper level than it is possible at the beginning. And that resting becomes more expansive, more about awareness, I would say, than mindfulness. There are, I guess, two key aspects to Mindfulness for Life. One is that it's a way of having a practice that connects with our life, and so it becomes less separate. It's not there's my practice over here and there's my life over here. The two really start to come together. And of course the other is not to forget that we do need to keep practicing. So as a group we're working and encouraging each other and going deeper into our true motivations for practice, so that that's going to sustain our practice for the rest of our life. The two important themes that I like to look at and that seem to be evolving through this group is interconnectedness, that this is the first one, because that's really the alternative to a feeling of separate, lonely self. It's this feeling that we're actually part of the world, and that's immense, because it's not a faked thing. It's not a meditating on interconnectedness. It's ways through our dialogue and through our practice of recognizing that we are part of the world. And that then makes us think, well, actually, what we're going to do about it. Through our extensive practice, we've got to the point that we could sit on the riverbank. We don't have to jump in and try and fix things all the time. And that's great, because otherwise even our attempts at compassionate action are really dealing with things that we can't handle ourselves, that are painful, or they're dealing with unresolved wishes to be popular or to be liked. If we get free of that, then we can really have spontaneous compassionate action. So we recognize the interconnectedness, and then the next phase, I feel, is that we're working on and we're going to explore during this next year of the Mindfulness for Life program. It's what I'm calling Awaken the World. A little bit like at the end of the Matrix. He's exposed the Matrix, and now what we're going to do. And that's what I'm inviting people to come and join us for an online seminar quite soon, and people that have completed mindfulness, compassion and insight, either informally through the Mindfulness Association programs or through the first 2 years of the MSc, very welcome to join us on the weekends and the end of year retreat.